Hey everyone, this is MusicTechHelpGuy, and welcome to part 10 of my Logic Pro 10 201 course. So in the next 3 videos, I'm going to be focusing in on fleshing out my arrangement and building in the synths, building in each section of the song. So this is going to be part composition, part sound design, part synthesis, and part mixing too. So the way I'm going to go about this is I'll already have some ideas done. I'll have some of the arrangement done, and I will deconstruct those ideas in reverse. Otherwise, these next 3 videos would end up being like 3 hours long each. So I don't want that to happen. I want something that's a little more manageable and digestible. So I've already done the work, most of the work, and I will sort of deconstruct each element of the arrangement and show you what I did. Really, everything I have here right now is very similar to or the same instruments as I had before. So it's just a matter of applying sound design and synthesis to these to modulate and morph these into something more interesting. So in this video, I'm going to focus in on the beat and the instruments in the chorus. And just for reference, let me play back the chorus, what it sounded like at the end of the last video. Okay, so here's what I've done to it so far. All right, so it's got this really thick, meaty tone, and that's really what I was going for. The other parts of the song are actually pretty simple and sort of driving and straightforward. The chorus is kind of this is going to sound weird, but I imagine it sounding like trying to like walk through molasses, you know what I mean? Like the bass makes it feel like it's just chugging along slowly, even though the beat is moving pretty quick. And so that's the only part of the song that's like that, is the intro and then the chorus. And like I said, the verses are actually pretty simple when we get to those. Let me start with the drum kit. You probably heard some low subs in there. What I ended up doing, well, first of all, what I did was I simplified the beat a little bit at the fills. I basically went in at the fills and just muted some notes and cut some notes out, and just to simplify them. So here's the first fill. And then here's the second fill. So I just simplified the beat a bit. So in the Drum Machine Designer, I added 2 more sub kicks. And on the first sub kick, it's just the original sub kick. And I found that the tuning of that note was the same as the first chord. So as you recall, it was G, A, and then B, because we were in B minor. So what I did was I pitched these bass notes to be G, A, and then B. Now, if you control the pitch directly, like C3 here, that doesn't mean that the sample is at the pitch of C3. That's just a reference pitch. So if I want to go from G to A, that means I've got to go up 2 half steps. So don't pay attention to the actual pitch itself, just pay attention to the relative shifting that you're doing. So if I wanted this to go up, an octave, I'd go up to C4. If I wanted to go up 2 half steps, I'd go from C up to D. And that's exactly what I did. So I left this one at C, pulled this one up 2 half steps, shortened the decay on that one a bit, and then the last one I lowered down essentially what would be 8 half steps. And 8 half steps ends up being minor 6th. So these correspond with the bass note of the 3 chords that are in the chords and in the bass line. So all together, the whole drum beat sounds like this. And that just repeats. The reason why I didn't put the low C in here is I just didn't want it to be too repetitive. So it's like 2 high basses and then empty, 2 high basses, low bass. So that low bass that's really going to get felt in your chest isn't overused. So that's what I did there, and that's sort of creating like a bass line. One thing I think I'm going to do though, I'm going to go into my mixer, is I want to have individual control over the levels of all 3 of the sub kicks. So what I'm going to do is, instead of busing these to their group, I'm going to bus these over to bus 12. So I'll put this one on bus 12 too. They're kind of out of order. And then this channel, I'm going to call this sub bass. And let's see if we can solo that and see what happens. So now I have individual control over the levels of the sub bass, and it's not going through all of the effects on the main channel. So that's good. Let's listen to that one more time all together.
Please tell me how, when all the world is lost, we're losing ground.
So next up is the ES2 bass. This was essentially a pulsing bass line that originally sounded something like this. And you can hear that I've pulled up the distortion on it quite a bit. So I'll pull that back up. I'm actually going to take this amplitude or amplifier modulation, I'm going to turn it off, and so it's just going to be whole notes. So you're still hearing some of that motion from the vector envelope that we added, and that's fine. And then what I did is I went over to the 3rd envelope, which controls volume, pulled the sustain all the way down, and then toyed with the decay time until I got something that was more like, I'm thinking like orchestral brass, but like synthesized orchestral brass. So that the notes don't hold out for their entirety. They're being ducked down by that decay. So after that, what I did was I added the Bit Crusher plugin, and I set the Bit Crusher to 8.5 drive, 17 resolution, and 20 times downsampling. And then what I did is I added this single band EQ, and I used a high cut filter, which is the same thing as a low pass filter, and I used automation to sweep the frequency of the filter. So one of the cool things about using a Bit Crusher with an EQ or filter sweep is it starts to sound kind of like a ya or wah sound, and again, trying to make the sound kind of like synthetic brass. I hate to say it, but almost like the Inception brass note, you know, if you've seen that movie. There's like this big, brass tone that's used in the soundtrack over and over and over again. It's overused. That's kind of what the sound I was going for here. So we're almost there. We're not quite there yet, but let me show you the automation. So if I just hit A to open up the automation here, you will see that automation. So what I did was I showed the single band frequency, and that's right down here. And then what I did was I wrote in the automation just for that. And what I did was I snapped the automation right here, turn that on, and I snapped it to 16th notes. and I started at 80 hertz. So for each note, this would start at 80 and end at 80 just before the note ends, like 1/16th note before the note ends. And since we're snapping automation, my automation points will snap to the grid. And then I created another point here, and at like around the 8th note mark, I pulled this up. And so it ends up doing something like this. And I had to copy the automation, obviously. So what I ended up doing was I just played around with this. And then I went and grabbed the automation curve tool and adjusted the shape of this. So how do I copy this effect? Well, if you grab your automation select tool, select all of that, and hold Option, you can duplicate and still snap that automation. So that's what I did there. Actually, I only went up to, in the original, I only went up to 2100 hertz. Now, that signal is pretty loud, so what I did is I added a gain plugin, and I just dropped the gain by 10 dB. And then the final step was just to add the Dream Hall preset under large spaces, under halls, in Space Designer, and I actually ended up pulling the dry signal below the wet signal. So here we're using, and this is going to be pretty common when it comes to sound design and synthesis, is you end up using things like reverbs and delays as sound design tools and less as mixing effects. I'm going to show you another example of this in a moment. So essentially, I just made this mostly wet signal, and on the output EQ, I think originally this had like a high frequency cut. I removed that. So what I ended up getting was this. And it's almost got this sort of like orchestral brass sort of sound to it. And it also helps to reinforce the sort of mid-range bass. Some speakers and headphones, that sub-kick doesn't even exist. So I always like to reinforce the mid-bass somewhere so that on smaller speakers and like things like earbuds, you can still hear that sub-bass. All right, the original synth layer that I created way back at the beginning of this course was just 2 or 3 synth pads and an arpeggiated effect. It sounded something like this. So the first thing I want to do is I want to get the arpeggio to not sound so muddy. So the first thing I did is I added the transposer. You can actually add multiple MIDI effects to the channel. You just have to hover over the top part of the plugin here, and you can stack as many as you want. And I just transposed this up 12 semitones. So now it's standing on top of those other chords. And I added a tremolo plugin, identical tremolo plugins, to these first 2 pads here. Tremolo as a modulation effect is like a volume-based pulsing effect. And what I did is I used the hard panning preset here and set the smoothing to 14, the depth at 100, and the rate at 16. And I also lined up both the left and the right channels so they're pulsing at the same time. And what this does is it creates a nice, cool sort of 16th note stutter effect. And then with the punchy electro arpeggiator, Now that on its own isn't too bad, but I want it to kind of dovetail in and out of the music. And the way I did this was by adding a bunch of kick drums as a sidechain compression source. If you don't know what sidechain ducking or sidechain compression ducking effect is, that's what we're going to do here. I just used the same tight kick sample that I used when I loaded it into Drum Machine Designer. And what I did is on the entire synth layer, I added the compressor plugin, and I chose, as a sidechain source up here, I chose that tight kick track as a sidechain compression source. So what this does is it makes every single time the kick hits, it makes the compression duck down. Now, you still have to set your threshold and ratio and makeup gain and attack and release time, but essentially the effect you get is this. Now, you heard that when I stopped it there, the makeup gain takes over and the compressor completely opens. We'll handle that in another video. We're gonna have to use some automation to get rid of that that tail that's on there. But you could see that every time the kick was hitting, the compression was ducking. Now, the thing is, that's kind of a cool beat on its own, but I'm actually going to mute the kick track and just use it as a sidechain source. It's not actually part of the song. If I take this 4 on the floor kick and mix it with this beat, it's just not going to sound good. But if I just play the synth layer by itself with the kick muted, you can still use that channel as a sidechain compression source. So it gives you sort of like a galloping effect. And I did go ahead and turn on the tremolo on the third synth pad down there. Now, some other things I want to do is I want to give this almost like a crystalline quality, and I also want to scoop out some of the high end. So the first thing I did after that was add a channel EQ before the compressor. This is just going to scoop out the low end, boost the mids, and scoop the high end. And then I added the delay designer plugin. Now let me just reset this, and I'll show you from scratch what I actually did. The effect sounds like this. It sounds like there's this bright sort of crystalline echoing effect on top of the synths. And the way I did that is I started with the 1/8 note alternating pan preset, which by itself, I'm actually going to turn the compressor off for a second here. By itself just sounds like this. It's just a basic 1/8 note echo or delay. And you can blend the wet and dry mix over here. So I'm going to put the dry pretty high and the wet pretty low. And the way that Delay Designer works is it works by various different taps. It's not a feedback-based delay. So what I did is dragged over all of these taps. Whoops. Let me just get back to those. Dragged over all those taps, right-click, and select Delete Taps. So now I just have 2 taps. And think of the taps as individual echoes. And then I set the grid to 16th notes instead of 8th notes and pulled the taps over so that they are a little bit quicker and a little bit shorter. So now the effect we have is this. It's a really fast sort of 16th note stutter. But I don't want the echoes to be the same pitch as the original. So if you go to the Transpose tab, you can actually individually transpose in semitones up or down by 1 whole octave each individual echo or each tap. So I'm going to pull them both up a full octave. This is going to sound a little weird, but bear with me. So that's just the wet signal. Sounds a little weird, but I want this to be sort of like a faint sort of echo, not something that's really like a blatant echo that's right in your face. So on the cutoff tab, you can actually, for each tap, you can add a low pass and a high pass to each tap. So this one, maybe I want up here. So I'm essentially band passing this from 940 hertz to 7100 hertz. And the next tap, I'll do the same thing, but I'll pull it down a bit so it's not so high. So I'm just creating two different taps. In addition to that, I'm going to go to the pan tab, and I'm going to hard pan these pretty hard, far left and far right. So now my echoes sound like this. And I also pulled the levels down here of each one. So now I can blend the dry back in and blend the wet echoes with the original synth patch. So it gives it a bit more space. Now you can play around with putting this before or after the compressor, but ultimately I found I liked it before the compressor because it seemed to sound more controlled to me.
Please tell me how, when all the world is lost, we're losing ground. There's no way out, there's no way back to salvation, we're losing ground.
All right, and that's pretty much all I did to the chorus. I thought about maybe adding some strings or some other sounds to layer on top of the sort of like low brassy sound here, but we'll get to that maybe after we record the vocals, or maybe I'll do it in one of the other arrangement videos and make it sort of like an optional thing. Maybe I'll use it in the intro, but don't use it in the choruses. What I'm concerned about is that in the chorus, when we record the vocals, we're gonna stack her voice up probably like 8 times with different harmonies. So it'll be pretty thick there and harmonically dense, and I don't want it to be more dense than it has to be. There's some things in mastering we can do to clean that up, but right now I'm pretty happy with where it's at. So in the next video, we'll continue on with fleshing out the arrangement of the song. So hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, please leave it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel to see more content like this. Check me out on social media, on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and on Patreon. As always, thanks for the support, and thanks for watching.